All right. Welcome to this second webinar from the European Journal of Engineering Education. We are very grateful to Dr. Matteo de Andrade from UCL for organizing this. He is a deputy editor of the journal with a special mission to support the quality of quantitative studies. And he is working on this mission together with Associate Editor Professor Eleanor Jones, who is also at UCL. So we have the strongest team you can imagine for this task. And the aim of this program of webinars is to support our authors and also the editorial team. And the point is to improve our competence in a constructive and friendly way, and not just rejecting manuscripts. I'm very happy at this approach that you are taking, Matt. And to maximize our learning, we are recording the seminar and we will post it on the SEFI YouTube channel. So the good news is you can watch it as many times as you want. And you can also let your colleagues and PhD students know about this resource. We hope that despite the recording, you will still want to keep the camera on and ask questions when Matt invites you. And we have both the chat and the Q&A enabled. And we imagine that maybe you want to use the chat for discussions among yourselves and the Q&A for questions to Matt. And even if he doesn't get to answer your questions, it's actually very helpful to know about your thoughts and what you are wondering about. So feel free to ask whenever you are confused or you want to know more. Yeah, we are delighted to see so many participants joining us. So let's not keep all of you waiting. Take it away, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. So, welcome everyone. As Christina introduced me, I'm Dr. Matteo de Andrade, but you can call me Matt. I work at the UCL Center for Engineering Education and have been working as a deputy editor of the EJEE, trying to give support to authors and prospective authors and reviewers and editors in our quantitative research. And as many of you might know and might be here for, when we think about quantitative research, it's very common for the first thing to come to mind, surveys and questionnaires. And that's the theme of today. As you see, there's a part one in there, because once we started gathering everything that we wanted to talk about, it looked extremely long. It was a lot of stuff for one webinar. So we have split this up into several webinars, and I will give you an outline of how the webinars are going to go at the end of the session today. But today we will really focus on building quantitative research questions and thinking about what is quality measurement. It is very important for me to always start these webinars saying a word of thank you to our community. And it's a thank you from the editorial team in the EJEE, because we rely on a community of editors and reviewers that are generous with their time and expertise, and really give insights to authors during the publication process. And one thing that we would like to do with these webinars is to really actively support prospective authors in planning and preparing manuscripts for publication. Well, enough with introductions. Let's see what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're talking about 4 broad themes, and we're not talking about specific statistical tests per se. We're talking about the broader picture that goes around it, and on how we create a coherent narrative in a quantitative paper, from research questions to methods, up to validity and reliability, which is the quality of what we are measuring. So we will start talking about information quality. So what does quality look like in a quantitative study? We will then have a little bit of discussion on the types of quantitative research questions. Sometimes it can be easy to think that quantitative research questions are only limited to hypothesis testing and to p-values and t-tests and etc. But the quantitative toolkit that we have available for us in engineering education research is much broader. And today I would like to give you a bird's view of how it's broader. We will talk about high quality data and instruments, which are the crucial bit in a quantitative study. And then we will end talking about validity and reliability. To calibrate your expectations for today, I have tried to make every bit of maybe abstract concept that I talk about very concrete by giving examples in publications in the EJEE. And what I want to do with that is that I want to celebrate our authors and their contribution to the community. So let's take it away and let's just define what we mean when we say survey. A survey is actually it's the process of systematically collecting information about a population. And inside of the survey process, we might have questionnaires or scales or instruments, which are actually the set of questions that the participants answer. And these are data collection instruments in general. So just to guide your expectation, today we will focus on self-administered questionnaires that your participants fill in themselves with closed-ended responses. So we will not be talking about open text boxes. And mostly, since I will be talking a lot about validity and reliability, we will be talking about those types of questionnaires or scales that use Likert items. And just as a general way of wrapping up how we talk about a coherent story in a quantitative paper, I would like to talk about the concept of information quality. It's a concept proposed by Kenneth and Schmelly in a 2014 publication that you can see here at the bottom left, where they really aim at giving an account of how we can have applied statistics in the broadest sense to the social sciences and to the natural sciences and in every possible sense. So they come up with this framework where we think of quality of information, and that's the first thing that I would like to talk about. When you're drafting your manuscript, thinking about the quality of information that it brings to the community. And they define information quality as the potential of a data set to achieve a specific goal. This goal might be scientific or a practical goal by using a given empirical analysis. And if we are thinking about information quality as something that has several dimensions, those would be your specific goal, which is your research question, the data that you use to answer that research question, the analysis, and how useful the data and the analysis are in answering your research question. So there are these four important core components in quantitative research that is very good for us to address very explicitly and being generous to the reader and to the reviewer. So now let's start talking a bit about quantitative research questions, and I will give you some time for questions and comments in a little bit. So a good quantitative study will start with a high quality research question. And in Kennett's and Schmelly's framework, they give 4 indicators of a good research question, which I find very useful. First of all, that the research question is fit for purpose. It reflects maybe the scientific or the practical goal of your project or of your research. Second, which is important for quantitative research, It is a research question that can be quantifiable. So there is the process of transforming a problem into a question and a general question into a quantifiable question. And it's at this stage where maybe we might need to think about or explain in a manuscript why quantitative research instead of qualitative research or instead of both. It's in this stage that we think about, okay, so why am I sending out a survey instead of interviewing people? So that's the part of a quantifiable research question, is that there is a power in transforming your question into something that can be quantifiable. A good quantitative research question is also structured, and it is structured in the sense that from the research question and maybe the theory around it, you can define and circumscribe the contents and the structure of a specific data set and maybe a specific analysis that will go with that data set that will answer the question. So it's not as if research question, data, and analysis are disjoint. They are part of the very same argument. And finally, make sure that your research question is answerable, that you have a fixed and clear goalpost that is achievable with maybe the resources, the data, and the expertise that you have available. So it is very good to talk about how a research question might fit these four little criteria. And continuing on my theme of quantitative research questions, as a mathematics educator and as a statistics educator, I understand that there is a broad emphasis in the way that we teach statistics on going straight into frequentist statistics, which is hypothesis testing. And that can create a misperception that everything in statistics has to do with testing a hypothesis and with having a p-value smaller than 0.05. One important thing is that Schmeli, which is the same scientist behind the framework that I'm using, has had this really wonderful paper to read, which is called To Explain or to Predict, in which you can find here at the bottom. And in there, they outline three general types of research questions: quantitative research questions, and those might be descriptive research questions, where your aim is to explore empirical features of some measure in a population. Maybe explanation research questions, where you're really testing a causal hypothesis or a relationship that is derived from a theory, or could even be prediction, using current data to uncover associations and predict future observations. It's important here to really stop and reflect maybe on what type of research question is appropriate for the phenomenon that you're studying, or even to the resources that we have. For example, a descriptive research question might be more exploratory, more data-driven, and might be really exploring to see how does this intervention work in a specific population? What is the effect size? An explanation research question has a much stronger link to a specific theory in the field. It might be a theory of measurements, a theory of education, a theory of psychology, but that's the biggest distinction between the two. One, it's maybe informed by theory or contextualized by theory, the description, but the research question is not testing the theory itself, when an explanation research question is really testing hypotheses that you derive from a theory. Needless to say that these different types of research questions have different types of answers. So that's why it's important to really frame well and reflect before writing the manuscript on really what's the type of research question that is being answered. I would say that in my experience in the EJEE, we cater for a broad community and for a diverse community. We might publish papers that wants to describe what's happening, what's going on here, what happens when I implemented this intervention. And when you're going about answering a descriptive research question, you will focus on giving thorough summary stats about a population, maybe the intervention or the outcome that you're measuring. Sometimes you might not have assumptions of causality or even a pre-established model. That's not necessary, but you might not have it. But what's really important when exploring a descriptive research question is really to focus on reporting uncertainty metrics. So instead of, for example, if you're comparing two groups, instead of giving just the means of the two groups, maybe giving the 95% confidence interval of the two groups, or maybe reporting standard errors, because that gives the reader an understanding of the uncertainty of the estimates that you're making about the population in your description. So in a nutshell, that would be a descriptive research question and some basic elements that would be expected from an answer. I will only talk about an explanatory research question here. I will not go into a predictive, but for an explanatory research question, what you're looking really is into why something is happening or how it is happening. And the main piece of answer or of result that will be looked at in that type of manuscript is maybe evidence in favor or against a hypothesized relationship, evidence in favor or against a hypothesis. Those manuscripts, they are manuscripts that explicitly test a model derived from theory. So it is important to have a couple of paragraphs explicitly explain how a certain theory of education or of psychology or of social science in general gives rise to a hypothesis that you have that you might be testing. And the focus really in explanatory research is on minimizing bias. So for example, minimizing confounding, minimizing the effects of maybe a variable that explains other two, and giving results that are very clear and really explaining the variance. And in here, you're talking about your R squared. You really want a model or a theory that explains the variability in the data. And to give a practical example and celebrate our authors, and also to say that it's not an either or, that you can actually address all types of research questions. I have an example here. It's creating effective project-based courses, personal relevance and its relations to successful group work. And there are three research questions in this paper that are very clearly, explicitly stated. And in my understanding of them, they actually are covered the three types of research questions that we talked about. First, they ask how measures of personal relevance, the course, and specifically with regards to projects, relates to students' expectancy, perceived effort, group connectedness, and team dynamic. So it's an explanation question. You're looking for correlations, causation, relationships between variables. The second question, are there differences in personal relevance based on students' gender, academic year, or time of the semester? That's a description question. You're describing a specific measure in terms of gender, in terms of academic year, or in terms of time of the semester. And the third research question, does personal relevance, gender, or academic year predict students' project performance? A prediction question. And it does what it says on the tin. It tries to predict the future with current data. So just as a takeaway and as a lead to maybe some questions from the attendants, I would really encourage you to dedicate 1 to 2 paragraphs describing how your research question is aligned with the study goals, how it's quantifiable, how it's structured, and how it's answerable. Not all of this, but really devoting a couple of paragraphs explaining how the research question connects to the study design, to the data that is collected, to the analysis that are done, and to the results that you anticipate or that you have. That's being generous to the reader, and that really helps guide the reader onto what to look for when you're reading the rest of the paper. One thing that it is really important is that the type of research question, as we have seen, it really determines maybe the data that you collect, the analysis that you do, and the possible answers that you will have, or conclusions or takeaways from your paper. So it's very important to keep them tightly aligned. Sometimes I might see manuscripts that ask, how does gender affect, let's say, self-efficacy? When the research question is really, does gender affect self-efficacy? So being really precise with the research question to how it ties onto the data analysis, study design, and the conclusions is really important. Just a reminder that quantitative research questions are not limited to hypothesis testing. They might include it at some point, but they are not limited to it. And there's plenty of scope for people to do quantitative research that goes beyond hypothesis testing. And a final takeaway that I haven't really discussed before is that forming and exploring concepts, refining the way that we measure things, and revealing relationships are really legitimate goals of quantitative research. And these are little bits of the topics that we will talk about more in this webinar. So for now, let me just stop sharing for a second. And let me just see if anyone has a question, maybe on the Q&A or on the chat. Oh, I have an awesome question here from Gillian Saunders. Should you register your research protocol with your research design and research questions with OSF, for instance? So OSF is it's an institution, a body, an initiative, I don't know how quite to describe it, that is about open science. And it has come to be due to something that is called replication crises in other disciplines that are maybe a bit more mature than engineering education. And open sciences, they really allow researchers to upload your research protocol, your study design, the type of data that you want to collect, and the analysis that you will do before maybe doing their study or before even submitting a manuscript, so that the researchers have a timeline of stamps that one, they have not moved the goalpost, and it's something that can be effective in preventing practices like harking and p-hacking. To answer Gillian, Gillian, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I personally quite like when I am reviewing a paper that is OSF registered. But that's a personal inclination. I think it is important that you have asked this question because it gives us scope to bring a discussion in the engineering education community of how we can start implementing open science practices around. That's a really great question. Thank you. Let me see if there's any other questions. None? Any comments from anyone? Okay, so I'm good to move ahead. Yes, Gillian?
Thank you for answering my question. Yeah, I was wondering because there's often the temptation to fit your research questions afterwards to your results, and as a result, we don't have the right results, right? We tend to only we still haven't got that journal of negative results out there in any field, I don't think. But I think therefore I think we should, I hope, pre-registration will help people also to publish what wasn't working, so we can learn from that, and people don't reinvent the wheel. So that was really why I hope it will become better, and I think it helps researchers structure their research so much better.
Absolutely.
And therefore probably become better researchers.
That's an awesome contribution. Thank you, Gillian. I think that you might have given me an idea for maybe a topic of a future webinar. You will be dearly referenced if it comes true, but open science practices are very close to my heart. They really help the peer review process, the clarity and transparency of it. As Gillian says, it helps with negative results. We don't really have a journal of negative results. There is a lot of institutional and maybe even editorial pressure sometimes, not necessarily in the EJEE, but in general, with significant results. And those are the voices that, oh, awesome, thank you. Those are the types of voices that we really hoped we would hear in these webinars. Awesome. So I am just going to go ahead and let me see how much time we've got. We've still got a bit of time. And I will start talking about quantitative data. And data is your bread and butter in quantitative research. And I will just introduce what I'm going to talk about it in these terms. Access to large samples and access to super representative random samples or stratified sampling is something that, if we are honest, depends on institutional affordances or maybe funding or maybe on having the right framework in place. And personally, I've always felt very torn when I read reviews in the EJEE that completely disregard a manuscript based on the sample size. I don't think that that's the case. Of course, when you increase the sample, you get more precision in your estimates. You need a representative sample to make generalizations, but I feel like it's a much more constructive and nurturing way for the community for us just to explicitly say more or less what are the rules of the games in terms of samples, and let authors do the work in tempering claims or maybe in discussing this appropriately. So given that, I would say that there are two takeaway criteria for thinking about your sample, which is where you collect your data. And number one is that your sample is representative of the population of interest. This could range from a non-example of trying to understand first-year engineering students' attitudes by sampling high school students. That's definitely not a representative sample. But even if you are within the general population that you want, the sample must be representative. So making sure that the sample is balanced, that maybe certain voices are not being underrepresented or others overrepresented, and really taking care to make sure that the whole research process and in reporting, making that clear that whether the sample is representative or not. So having a representative sample is one of the number one arguments that you can use when someone asks you, can you generalize your findings beyond your sample? That is the bread and butter that gives you ammunition to maybe start making that argument. But a representative sample really depends on your sampling strategy. And that's something that I would like to be more explicit in the manuscripts that we have in the EJEE. Explicitly mentioning your sampling strategy. Is it a probability sample where everyone in the population has the same chance of being included in the study, or is it a non-probability sample? What type of sampling strategy did you use? Probability, stratified, convenience sampling, snowball. All of those details are really important, not only to judge the quality of the research. I think that that is one argument, but also for future efforts trying to understand where is our research at? So that maybe people in future reviews of the literature or meta reviews can have an understanding of what are the samples that we use in our quantitative research. So a good description of the sample goes a long way. And being transparent with the uncertainty that you have in any of your estimates. One thing about large numbers in samples is that it's not that your quality increases, but your uncertainty decreases. So you have narrow confidence intervals and you might have smaller standard errors. And it is really important to, when you're reporting maybe means or effect sizes, to report maybe a confidence interval for them, 95, 99, depending on the application, and or a standard error, so that anyone that reads it maybe understands, well, the mean of their student cohort in this questionnaire was 3.5, but the confidence interval was anywhere between 2.8 to 3.8. And so that other researchers have a little bit of ammunition to understand how they can read your results and interpret and apply into their settings. If you go to chapter 12 of this little book that I have here, listed on the right, they will talk a lot about how to describe a sample. And I have lifted some good guidelines on how to describe a sample, because that, again, is one of your best pieces of ammunition to argue for the generalizability of your study. And one aspect of it, one dimension of it, is defining your sample. So it's really looking at your population of interest and describing what are the characteristics of this population. Maybe the course, maybe the age, maybe the gender balance, maybe nationality. I don't know. All of those characteristics that you might or might not include in a study, they will also be constrained by your ethics approval for the study. So operating within your constraints and operating within general ethics approvals, make a description of the population. Maybe thinking of eligibility criteria for the study, if appropriate, and if appropriate, thinking of how you estimate sample size or how you justify your sample size. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But of these three, it's important for us to think about the sampling strategy and describing it very explicitly. If it's a probability sample, if it's stratified, if it's convenience, if it's snowball, and etc. There's a range of strategies that might be used, and each will be applicable to a certain context and affordances, describing the recruitment methods, and maybe discussing whether there is possibility for self-selection bias. The last dimension is the administration of the survey. What is the mode of administration? Is it online? Was it paper-based? Was it mailed to the participants? Whether incentives or compensation were offered, and incentives, maybe financial incentives, or entering a draw to win a prize, or even grades at the end of a course. So that all counts as incentives and compensation, and that's detail that your reviewers might want to see. But also providing an account of complete and partial response rates and what you do with the partial responses, and having a little thing, having a words to say about the people that did not respond to the survey. Is there a reason for you to think that they did not respond to the survey? Who are they? Who are the people that did not respond to the survey? Those are all good indicators for you to describe how your sample is representative and to talk about your uncertainty. So again, to talk about some practical examples in the EJEE, I have this article here, Student Reactions to the Development of Professional Engineering Competencies. And I have really just underlined the last part of the paragraph where the authors highlight, it is worth noting that the percentage of female respondents in the sample population was higher than that in the study population. This may suggest a form of selection bias. This is a really nice and clear and quick way to maybe acknowledge and to recognize how your sample might be representative. But looking at the other good practices that we can see in here, the authors clearly outline the cleaning process of the data where the partial responses were removed. They describe the sample in terms of age and gender, and they finish with acknowledging a form of selection bias, potential selection bias. Another good example that I found in the EJEE, engineering students' approaches to learning in two student-centered instructional models before and during COVID-19 pandemic. They really describe the sample with what I think is a thick description. The number, the percentages, gender-wise, the average age, and even gendered average age. And because in this study, they needed to separate the participants into two groups, they decided that for their design and for their research questions, it was important to ensure gender distribution in the two groups that was close to the overall gender distribution of the sample. As another good example, we have this study, high-performing male and female engineering students in Chile, accounting for mental health and well-being from a developmental paradigm. And they describe the eligible participants, but then they go and they cut down into those eligible participants into 20 high-achieving males and 20 high-achieving females for answering their specific research question. So it really describes how the initial pool of participants went down to a selected pool. Those are some good examples of describing the population, describing the sample, and giving the reader some insights of as to why the data is representative. As I was saying, sample sizes. Sample size justification. It is important. I think justification or discussion would be a great word here. And one meta-scientist from TU Eindhoven that I find really helpful, his writings, Daniel Lakens, has published this paper where he discusses sample size justification, why or why not justify sample sizes, and what are the general trends that you see in the literature for the practices for sample size justification. And he lists 5 types of justification. And the first is resource constraints. He doesn't list 5 types. Actually, I think that he lists maybe 6 or 7 that I cut down to 5. So the first one would be resource constraints, maybe because sample sizes are always practically always limited by available resources, time, and finance. Precision, sometimes sample sizes are determined to reach a specific precision of the estimate that you want. The golden rule for confirmatory analysis and hypothesis testing, which is an a priori power analysis. So the sample size is decided based on a power analysis that takes into account the power that you want, the alpha, the test, and the effect size. Sometimes in the literature, we see that there's some landmark literature or some reference that provides a rule of thumb saying, oh, it is okay if you use 30 people per group here. And sometimes there's no justification. But I would just like to leave this reference here in case anyone that is watching this webinar comes to struggle with justifying their sample size. You will be able to watch it on YouTube later and to copy the DOI. But this is a really good and powerful resource that can help you with that type of discussion. One example of sample size justification in the EJEE that I found was this paper, Implementing Serious Games Through a Pedagogical Lens in Engineering Education, an Experimental Study. And please do not try to read the whole paragraph because it's a lot of text, but they really start the idea of the study trying to determine an appropriate sample size. And for that, they do a literature review, trying to understand what is the effect size that you would expect from that type of intervention. And they chose an effect size of 0.75, which is, I think, between medium and large by Cohen's definition. And then they justify the sample size required for each group. One thing that is important is that if we want our research to be reproducible and to be useful to other people, it is really important to not only report mean differences or p-values, but to make it a practice of reporting effect sizes, Cohen's T or maybe Hedges T. I don't know, whatever effect size is appropriate for your analysis, report them, because those are the best chances that someone trying to maybe replicate your study or to do a similar study in the future has of understanding how many people they need in their sample to have enough power to detect a significant effect. So now is another pause and another takeaway here for us. The first idea of justifying your data is explaining why the data set is appropriate to your research question. And hopefully I will try to come back to the research question as often as possible. It is not really nice when you read the paper and when you're halfway through the methodology section, you don't remember the research question. Try to communicate it through your descriptions of other things. So that's to be generous to the reader and to keep the reader focused. Remember to really discuss your population characteristics, eligibility for the study, how you recruited people, whether incentives were given, and mode of administration. But this is more of a checklist type of item, right? One thing that I believe would be really good for our development is explicitly stating the sampling strategy, maybe probability, stratified, convenience, snowball. And in the Cohen reference that I left a couple of slides ago, there's a really nice description of all of them. And because once we start stating the sampling strategy and the research design, that is what really gives us more ammunition to generalize findings, even more, I would say, than specific types of tests. And again, finally, providing a transparent account of response and non-response rates, as well as partial or incomplete responses and discarded entries. And now what we're gonna start talking about is what I think is the slightly more, it's not difficult, but the part that it can create revisions during peer review. And that's the preliminary quantitative analysis. And so let me just go back to the research questions. And this was not agreed between Christine and I, but let's just go back to talk about research questions. When you read this more philosophically inclined literature on statistics, you will see these keywords like empirical and theory, these little contrasts between what's empirical and what's rational, empirical and theory, and etc. And the glue, the link between these types of research questions is really the presence of a theory. And in here, what I mean is a theory of measurement. in that it is so easy for us to take measurement at face value, but a theorized perspective on measurement is really important. And that in here, we're going to the analysis part, but it's the pre-analysis really. And the idea is that analyzing quantitative data without the guidance of a theory can result in results that are uninterpretable, maybe non-comparable, or even misleading. And the first analysis that must be done to the data, especially if you're using surveys, is the quality of measurement itself. The first question is, what am I measuring with this? And how does this thing that I'm measuring help me answer my research question? And of course, those things are easier said than done. But I hope that in this part of the webinar, I can equip you with some of the tools that have been systematically reviewed in the literature to be sufficient evidence for quality of measurement. And we all hear about validity and reliability in measurement and in inference of measurements, but those terms themselves, they are based on theories of measurement. So sometimes I see that we might use the tools, so really being method oriented, using the tools. Okay, I've calculated my Cronbach alpha. Okay, I have done some factor analysis, really going into the methods without taking a step back and trying to think what's the problem that the method aims to solve anyway. So in here, I hope that I give you the problem and the questions. And I would like to start with the case of student engagement. And I will comment on the scoping review of research instruments for measuring student engagement. And the title pretty much says what the authors found in need for convergence. So in this study, the authors looked at, surveyed the literature, and they found about 243 studies identifying measurement instruments for student engagement. And by measurement instruments, think about a questionnaire or a survey or a scale. 103 of these studies did not provide any information on the instruments used. So it is the same as making a measurement and not saying what tool you used for that measurement. But when you look at the statistics, it gives you a very scary view. 67% of the instruments were not tested for reliability and were being used for the first time. So these were ad hoc instruments where no consideration on whether the measurements were reliable was given or discussed in the paper. 3% not tested for reliability again, but previously used. So it's a slightly more difficult situation where an instrument that has not been tested for reliability, has not been well characterized and studied is replicated. And then we have 8% of first use instruments tested for reliability and 22% tested for reliability and previously used. It is my perception of the EJEE that in this we're doing quite well, actually. We tend to be on the side of at least testing for reliability in most of the instruments, and lots of our authors, they used previously validated instruments, or they validate their instruments before they use it. But this is a general trend when we're talking about survey and questionnaire studies, that there is very poor documentation of what's being measured, if anything is being measured at all. Another systematic review, this one is in PLOS Medicine, and it's in medical education, which is a slightly more mature field maybe, where the authors, they looked at reporting guidelines for survey research, and they analyzed both the reporting guidelines from maybe journals and editorial teams, and the reporting guidelines in the reporting practices in the studies themselves. So they found 117 studies. They they decided to analyze 117 studies, but then you look at the statistics. 34% did not provide access to the questionnaire or the survey or the items that were being used. 82% of new instruments did not report how they were developed. So maybe what theory informed it, what domain they were aiming to measure, whether they interviewed participants to understand if they conceptualized it in the same way. So none of that. And 77% of studies using existing instruments did not report validity and reliability metrics. So from that, what it's a recommendation that I make anytime that a paper like this ends up in my desk. Provide access to the instrument in full, whether it's in the text, whether it's via a reference if you're using it verbatim, or if you don't want to have it in your paper for presentation, let's say in an appendix. For new instruments, it is really important to report the development process. And in fact, developing a survey, a questionnaire, is actually a research project in itself. So it is really important to go through to provide evidence that in developing a questionnaire, you have gone through the generally accepted landmarks of quality development in a questionnaire, which is item generation from a literature review, maybe an expert review, maybe cognitive interviews with the population of interest to understand whether the words make sense to them and whether they conceptualize the items in the survey in the way that you intend. Maybe piloting to understand whether you're aiming for a more or less neat factor structure, doing some factor analysis and documenting reliability. So in summary from these two slides, it can be that survey research is done in a very ad hoc way when it doesn't need to be, when that's actually the most difficult way, I would say, to do it. But to stop capitalizing on the deficit and to start giving you the tools, the mental tools to think about what is the type of evidence that is important to report. In general, it is called validity and reliability evidence. And for this, I really like this reference that I'm leaving here. I think it is a very concise reference on gathering validity and reliability evidence. And they really survey the literature and they talk about the trends in the field of STEM education. And I feel it's one of the friendliest introductions to psychometric evidence. And psychometric evidence in general is evidence of measurement quality. I would call them the same for the purposes of today. And the way that they have framed it is that the evidence for validity and reliability, you can look at it maybe in a segmental way, but let's start talking about evidence for validity. So what is the evidence that we can present that our study with the questionnaire is valid? Validity, it could be test content. It's one of the ones that we see the most in the EJEE, which is maybe an expert's review or of the response process, doing qualitative interviews with students to understand how they conceptualize it. And I have highlighted them in blue because if we're looking at quantitative engineering and education research from this lens, it is important to think about it being more mixed methods than purely quantitative. That really the qualitative part of gathering evidence of validity are really important. And then you will have some other quantitative types of evidence for both validity and reliability that you can give. Maybe evidence of internal structure, of relationships between variables, test, retest, alternate form, and internal consistency. So this literature review is a really good read that I would recommend, and I will start unpacking some of these things that I have said now. So when they surveyed the literature for validity evidence, two types of qualitative evidence were present, mostly judge evaluation, which is I call expert evaluation, and response process. I have seen quite a few times in our review process in the EJEE, reviewers asking authors to reframe um, expert evaluation as evidence of surface validity. And my understanding is that the broader community really conceptualizes expert evaluation of the items of a questionnaire as a legitimate, but just as the first step into providing evidence of validity. More evidence than expert evaluation is needed. You can have response process where participants are interviewed to understand how they conceptualize items. And then we go into some of the quantitative types of evidence with quantitative methods for validity. In the EJEE, most of the papers that I see and that I have reviewed, they normally use factor analysis, either exploratory factor analysis or confirmatory factor analysis. And what that aims to do is to review the internal structure of the items in a survey and to really review maybe what are the factors that lead respondents to respond in a certain way. There are some more, let's say, advanced evidence, types of evidence for validity. Convergent or discriminant validity would be administering your test or your survey in parallel with another test or survey. If you're looking for convergent evidence, you would administer yours and administer another survey that is measuring something that is similar. So maybe if I were administering a survey for self-efficacy, I could also administer one on self-guided learning or something like that. So it's the idea of contrasting and comparing your results with something that is very similar or something that is very different. And if you're not one who wants to do research based on factors, differential item function is one of the most popular theories, not one of the most popular. We see here a mere 6%, but it is a powerful type of theory and methodology to understand how items behave across different groups. In terms of reliability evidence, the most popular by a long run is Cronbach alpha, with about 94% of the reports reviewed in the systematic literature review reporting, and that aligns with my experience in the EJEE, even though sometimes we might see a slightly different form. But that's not to say that that's the only evidence of reliability that we have. We might have forms of reliability like test-retest or alternate form, and all of these, they strengthen the evidence of reliability. Now, as not a last word on it here today, but I was discussing validity and reliability with a colleague from the US that works in that does a PhD in psychometrics, right? They do a PhD in educational measurement itself. And a very interesting paper that they suggested to me was this paper by Michael Kane, validating the interpretations and uses of test scores. And the general argument in here, it's a slightly different facet of the argument that is given here. The argument that this systematic review gives is that for validity, you might have a list, a checklist of types of evidence that you provide, and boom, your instrument is valid. But the more modern and more accepted view of validity nowadays is that validity is not a binary yes or no property of an instrument. Validity is a property of the assumptions, the inferences, the claims, and the consequences of using the instruments in a specific context. So there's no yes or no answer to validity. There is a constant argument in a spectrum that the claims and the inferences that you're making with your instrument are valid. Another point that I would like to bring everyone's attention to, and that I mentioned very briefly here at the start, is that validity and reliability might not travel well. And it is really important to understand the population and the context and the use of where the instrument has been developed, because using an instrument that has been developed for maybe a weird population might lead to biased results in a population that is not weird. So those are considerations to have. And finally, take care when you're cherry picking items from existing questionnaires, because this can lead to a very messy factor structure. The example that I have from the EJEE is this one where they show the development, validation, and use. So you see, for me, it's very important to highlight that it's development, validation, then use of an interprofessional project management questionnaire in engineering education. So let's start with the context of where they did this. The students were studying courses in their second, third, or fourth year, where interprofessional project management was particularly relevant. And they had a design project or an inquiry laboratory activity. So in this work here, which I really recommend you take a read because it's a really nice recipe, a really good reference. They do a literature review, and they found from the literature review that none of the existing instruments really included the range of factors that they deemed important from their interactions with the students. And just drawing a parallel to you here, maybe not the range of factors that you deem important as a researcher in the domain. They say it would have been possible to mix and match different measures, but we could have produced a set of questions with messy and overlapping factor structures and maybe caused confusion. So they justify the development of a fit-for-purpose instrument. And what I find really, really nice about this paper is that it really stages the research questions. They have a central empirical question, which is whether, yes or no, it is a valid and reliable instrument for what they want to do with it. And another part of the paper, which I did not include in the screenshots, is that they also tested whether the instrument worked in the same way in French and English. And catering to our broad European audience, I would say that the overwhelming majority of the authors that submit to the EJEE are working in non-English speaking countries. So I think that this is an awesome example of going a bit away from the English-centered literature. They developed and validated the questionnaire in French. So there is the rationale for developing something, there is the literature review, there is their personal feeling from working with students and their personal experience that, well, these questionnaires are not really where we want them to be. And they really start by outlining development, validation, and then use, the 3 stages. So how did they do it? The first thing is what I imagine, Paul, you're doing right now, is they developed a set of statements. And these statements, they had domains. And these were all domains of interprofessional project management. What are the important domains in interprofessional project management? Maybe project planning, risk management, ethical sensitivity, team communication, interprofessional competence. And they developed at least 4 to 5 items for each. I would say develop 5 items if you're developing at the very minimum. I have seen studies where people develop 10 items per construct that they want to measure if they're just starting to do it. So they present the full text of the items and they talk about the domains that inform the items. So maybe in Paul's example, researching creativity, it could be visual creativity, writing creativity. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the theory of creativity. I'm just trying to get examples off my head. So getting a domain that is important and dividing it in subdomains and then drawing the items from there with based on the literature and maybe based on experience, or like your basis for the items is really yours. The first question that they ask after they draw the items and get results is, can I do a factor analysis? That's the first question that you do with questionnaire data. Can I do a factor analysis on this questionnaire data? And this is assuming that you want to do factor analysis, but it's our most common methodology. So they use something that is called the KMO and the Bartlett's test. And the results of this test, they give you evidence in favor or against of using the items for a factor analysis. They passed this first check. Then they ask, how many factors should be extracted from the data? So they're really asking how many important little theoretical blurbs in interprofessional management really affect the way that students respond to this. How many factors? They used a methodology called Horn's parallel analysis, but you might use Kaiser's rule or a script plot. Okay. They decided on 4 here, I think. Then they asked themselves theoretically, well, are the factors correlated? Is project planning correlated to risk management and to ethical sensitivity and team communication? Can these subdomains correlate? Well, in their theory, yes. So they allowed the factors to correlate. That means using an Oblin rotation. They got a lot of numbers as results. So how did they interpret it? They defined that items that loaded by less than 0.3 in factors should be ignored. Great, they know how to interpret the results. Then are the results reliable? They use Cronbach alpha in each factor to determine the reliability. So now, everyone, I just want to bring everyone's attention back here because I find this paper really interesting because they hypothesized in the beginning that they would have 5 domains, but their exploratory factor analysis showed that the factors that explained the ways that students answered items were actually 4. So the first factor you can see here, the second factor here, the third factor here, and the fourth factor here. And they say how each of the items loaded in them. You will see that some of the initial items are missing. It is because during the factor analysis, they dropped the items. The items just did not give them an indication of anything meaningful. They calculate Cronbach alpha for each factor, and calculating Cronbach alpha per factor is a better practice than per full instrument. If you're doing a full instrument, you should use McDonald's omega because it accounts for multiple factors, but we will see that in a future webinar. And all of the numbers that are missing here are numbers smaller than 0.3, which they ignored. So the initial item pool was derived from the literature and from experiencing working with students. That was a theory-informed item pool. Then what they did is that they let the questionnaire out in the wild and they crunched the numbers. And the factors that make students respond in specific ways to specific questions, they emerge from an exploratory factor analysis. And the interesting thing is that they started thinking of 5 domains, but then they merged team communication and interprofessional competence as one domain in the end. And again, this gives evidence, as we were talking about validity, this gives evidence of structural validity. It gives evidence that, yes, the items that you drafted for each factor, for each subdomain, unprompted, when given to respondents, they cluster together through an algorithm. So I hope I think that everyone might have seen the name of the study. You can go back to the YouTube recording later if you haven't. So the takeaway here, and I will really ask this, report survey items in full. It will be generous to your readers, it will be generous to your editors, and it will be generous to anyone maybe trying to reuse what you do. Give an account of the factors covered by those items and the theoretical and practical basis. This is where the literature review that Paul has been doing goes in his example, for example. Really report how you developed, adapted the items, maybe how you interviewed students to check that they interpret it in the same way that you intend, and how you piloted and validated it. Remember that validity and reliability include both qualitative and quantitative. I am very happy when Christina introduces me as our quant editor, but I really like to think that good research is mixed methods. Nothing against purely qualitative, nothing against purely quantitative, but I think that good research normally draws from every possible source of valid evidence that it can. And really, more explicitly, gather a broad diversity of validity and reliability evidence. Try to get evidence from multiple sources, because remember, validity is not a property of the items or the questions or of the questionnaire. Validity is a property of the claims that you will make by using that questionnaire and the consequences that can exist after you make a claim from that questionnaire. So this view of validity, that it's validity of the arguments and validity of the claim rather than the validity of the instrument, brings the responsibility for making valid claims to us, the researchers. The responsibility for the uses and the consequences of what we do is ours, is not of the instrument, because an instrument cannot be responsible for something. Everyone, I appreciate that this was a long webinar. And just to let you know, I've split it into 4 from my original set of slides. Anyone that would like to learn a bit more about educational measurements, remember that I talked about how important it is to have a measurement theory. I cannot recommend enough this resource. If the QR code link doesn't work, this is the link, theta minus b. This is a joke, okay? This is a joke of, I think, item response theory, theta minus b. Intro to measurement in R. It's open source. You can actually use this to teach if you're doing capacity building with researchers. The language is friendly. The breadth of concepts is awesome. It has concrete examples and it has examples of code. So the how-to is also in there. And it's made by Tony Albano by University of California, Davis. There will be a part 2 to this webinar, and any of you that would like to keep learning and thinking about exploratory, confirmatory factor analysis, reporting, surveys and instruments, really, really welcome to join. It would be our pleasure. But I have some practical resources here. One, for really grasping the theoretical, philosophical, scientific relevance of measurements and of measurements theory. This book, Measurement Theory and Application for the Social Sciences by Deborah Bandalos. It's one of the ones that I've liked the most of the ones that I have been studying. And for exploratory, confirmatory, factor analysis, structural equation modeling, this book by Klein is really what I would consider a really reference textbook, because it's very clear and it's very good in giving resources for interpreting linear regressions. As a big summary, describe the research objectives, the population and context of measurements, and the intended purpose and use of the survey, and always come back to the research question and objectives. When you are planning a study, think, are there existing questionnaires? Will they be used? If not, why not? Why yes? But if you do create a new questionnaire, describe the development process in detail. And it's better to prepare than to have a reviewer asking you for it. Evidence of validity and reliability provides as broad evidence as you can. And again, remember to describe the sample and the uncertainty of the estimates. Those would be the general takeaway messages for today. If you are willing to have, if you want a more checklist style of what to do, what to include in papers with surveys and questionnaires, these 3 papers, they're very useful. I discussed one of them here. So checklists for reporting survey studies, analysis of published guidance, and this last one, quality of reporting web-based and non-web-based survey studies. Those are really, really good resources, and they provide you more the checklist level items and rationale for including them. And finally, we already have the date for the next workshop. So for the next workshop, we're going to talk about reporting. How can we report in a way that lets other people really build onto our results, and really thinking about when you report statistical results in a paper, that becomes data for a future systematic review. So how can we make the job of meta scientists easier and strengthen the field? That will be the theme of the next one. And then the theme of the following one, which shouldn't be much later, is a step-by-step tutorial on exploratory factor analysis. So we will get a nice real-world data set, and we will go step by step doing exploratory factor analysis.